Okay, everybody. Well, here we go with our first content lecture of the semester, and it's going to cover the material in Chapter 1 of the textbook, and that's Sports Psychology, Discipline, and Profession. So, what is sports psychology? So here's a textbook definition from one of Cox's earlier editions, and says that sports psychology is a science where the principles of psychology are applied in a sport or exercise setting. And really there are two things that sports psychologists try to accomplish. The first of those is performance enhancement of teams and individuals, but we're also interested in improvement of people as human beings, and that's the concept of human enrichment. And so we can add the concept of exercise psychology here, which is the study of the effect of psychological and emotional factors on sport and exercise performance, and the effect of sport and exercise involvement on psychological and emotional factors. So you have that kind of reciprocal or two-way thing going on there. All right, so to understand what sports psychologists do and what kind of questions we might be interested in, let's look at a little quiz here. So first of all, are distance runners more introverted than basketball players? Of course, introverted means withdrawn, the opposite of extroverted, which means outgoing. Should tennis players psych up to prepare for a tennis or a championship tennis match? Will children be more likely to participate in a community soccer program if t-shirts and awards are offered? Will the employees in a company's noon jogging program run longer if they run in a group than if they run alone? Should we encourage aggressive play and fighting in ice hockey as a way to let off steam? And finally, can mental imagery be used to aid in healing from disease or injury? Okay, so what do you think? Well, let's look at some answers. So first of all, are distance runners more introverted than basketball players? Well, the research says no. Research shows that athletes in general are more extroverted than non-athletes, but no research has shown consistent personality differences between athletes from different sports. That was actually one of the earliest lines of research that took place in sports psychology, was attempting to differentiate between athletes in different sports and between athletes in different positions within sports by virtue of their personality, and it just proved to be kind of a dead end. Should tennis players psych up to prepare for a championship match? Well, the answer to that is no. It's generally not necessary. The fact that it is a championship match is usually enough to get people aroused enough to, or excited enough to perform to their optimal level. If anything, people might get too charged up and have to be brought down a little bit with arousal and anxiety reduction strategies. Will children be more likely to participate in a community soccer program if t-shirts and awards are offered? What do you think? Well, the answer to that is yes. A t-shirt, an award, a trophy, even praise, those are things that come from outside the individual, so they're called extrinsic rewards, and they do have power to motivate people to get involved, but in order to keep people involved over the long haul, they need to be intrinsically motivated. So you have to be careful with the use of extrinsic rewards because they can undermine intrinsic motivation, which ultimately you want to develop and foster. Will employees in a company's noon jogging program run longer if they run in a group than if they run alone? And the answer to that is a definitive yes. It's a concept called social facilitation. Actually, one of the very first sports psychology studies back in the late 1800s was done on the concept of social facilitation. So individuals' motivation and persistence increases when others are present. Should we encourage aggressive play and fighting in ice hockey as a way to let off steam? I grew up in Canada. I grew up playing hockey. Fighting was part of the game. It certainly was something we saw when we looked at professional athletes. But if, we don't want aggression in our games, then, we really need to do something differently about that. So the idea of letting off steam is what's called the catharsis hypothesis, and it's been largely discounted by the research. Aggressive behavior is only going to be reduced if you sanction it, if you punish it. That will extinguish the behavior. If you reinforce it by, looking at professional athletes who do it, seeing them be cheered and get praise and encouragement, then it actually increases the likelihood that that behavior is going to continue. And then finally, can mental imagery be used to aid in the healing from disease or injury? And the answer to that is it's unclear at this point. It's a challenging area to study for a number of reasons. There are some lines of research that say that it does have a positive effect. There are others that haven't proven that. So at this point, the research is really equivocal on this, and it may be 10 years down the line we'll have a much clearer answer, and then we'll be able to definitively say yes or no. But right now, we can't make those claims. All right, so when we think about various topics in sports psychology, what might be included in a sports psychology course or in a sports psychology textbook, these are the kinds of things that you'll see. So personality, which we're going to study in the next lesson in Chapter 2, attention or concentration, anxiety, arousal adjustment strategies, cognitive behavioral interventions, and so on. I'm not going to read all these to you. I'll let you take a look at these topics on your own here. And then health psychology is an area that's evolved on its own. There are courses, entire courses that are taught on health psychology, and that can include things like patterns of adherence and non-adherence to exercise, the impact of stress on health, pain prevention and treatment, coping with stress and pain, and so on and so forth. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the key people in the development of sports psychology. I think it's important to understand the folks that, to learn a little bit about the folks that have given birth to, a field of study. And so, let's take a look at a few of these folks. So way back in 1897, Norman Triplett did the first study that we could classify as sports psychology, and it was that concept of social facilitation that I mentioned earlier. Triplett studied cyclists, and cycling is something that I do now for exercise. But he studied cyclists under three conditions. One, when they were cycling alone for time. Another one when they were cycling with other people for time, and then a third condition where they were cycling with others, but they were actually competing against one another. And so the poorest performance, the slowest times were when individuals were by themselves. Next fastest would be when they were cycling with others and not competing, and then the fastest or the best performance was when they were cycling with others and actually competing against them. And Coleman Griffith was a professor at the University of Illinois. He's considered to be the father of sports psychology in North America. Griffith had a number of graduate students, and of course the idea was that those students would go on and they'd go out into the field and go to other universities and continue to teach and practice sports psychology. But what happened was the students didn't do that. They went off and they studied other areas of mainstream psychology instead of sports psychology, and so Griffith is considered to be a prophet without disciples, and sports psychology kind of went dormant for a period of time after he left, and because his students didn't carry on the work. But there were a number of individuals that were working in the area of motor learning. Franklin Henry, John Lother, Arthur Slater Hamill. They were studying motor learning, motor behavior, the acquisition of skills and things like that, which ultimately became the parent discipline of sports psychology. So they were studying the motor, and the cognitive aspects kind of came later. Bruce Ogilvie was a professor at California University, Berkeley, I believe, and he's considered to be the father of applied sports psychology, one of the first ones to actually take the principles of sports psychology and use it with teams and individuals for performance enhancement. And then Rainer Martens is considered to be the father of modern sports psychology. He also was at the University of Illinois. He was a wrestler there and a coach. He recognized the need to, both do research and then to bring the knowledge that was obtained through research into the practice of applying that to athletes and athletics. And so you'll read about Martens later on when we start talking about some of the different aspects of personality. In Europe, a number of people that were important in the development of sports psychology. Baron Pierre de Coubertin, a French aristocrat, was president of the IOC from 1896 to 1925. He is credited with reviving the Olympic Games, with establishing the modern Olympics in 1896, but he was also the first person to use the term sports psychology way back then. Cesarevich Puni, a professor at Lezgraf University in Leningrad, started the first sports psychology program there way back in 1898. And then Peter Rudik founded the first sports psychology laboratory in the Soviet Union in 1925. All right, so, as fields of study evolve, usually professional organizations pop up to deal with the issues and concerns of the emerging disciplines. And there are a number of professional societies that exist to serve the needs of sports psychology and sports psychologists. First one of those is ISSP, the International Society of Sports Psychology. Has probably been around the longest. And here in North America, we have the North American Society for the Psychology of Sport and Physical Activity. In the lesson for this week, I've provided links to these different organizations so you can go directly to them and kind of poke around their websites and see what they're all about. Then the Canadian counterpart is the Canadian Society for Psychomotor Learning and Sports Psychology. And then an organization emerged. It was kind of a splinter group off of the North American Society for Psychology of Sport and Physical Activity, NASPA, and it was designed to meet the needs of those individuals who were interested in more in the applied than the basic research and practice. And it's the Association for the Advancement of Applied Sports Psychology. Actually, it's shortened its name a little bit to the Association for Applied Sports Psychology. And then the American Psychological Association, I guess, kind of a key marker in the development of sports psychology was when APA, which is the Learned Society for all of psychology and psychologists and psychiatry, recognized that sports psychology was a legitimate thing and established a separate division, Division 47, to deal with that and address it. And then the United States Olympic Committee got involved in sports psychology. They saw that Europeans were typically doing better in some international competitions, and so they decided that they wanted to bring sports psychology into the U.S. Olympic program. And so they put out a call for individuals, with sports psychology backgrounds who might be interested in working with the Olympic teams. And what happened was they were absolutely inundated with applications from individuals with, all kinds of different backgrounds, and they couldn't really make much sense of it. And so they decided that they would get into the business of certification and credentialing, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. And then finally, there's the European Federation of Sports Psychology. All right, so individual certification is done largely through the Association for Applied Sports Psychology, and if you go through that certification process, you come out with the title, a bit cumbersome, but Certified Consultant, Association for Applied Sports Psychology. And the reason that they use the term certified consultant as opposed to psychology or psychologist is because that's a protected licensed term, and psychologists and psychiatrists get up in arms when people that don't have their background call themselves things that sound like that. And then there's the United States Olympic Committee, as I mentioned, and they have a sports psychology registry, so individuals can become part of that registry if they meet the criteria for one of three things: clinical or counseling sports psychologist, educational sports psychologist, and that's an area that I would kind of put myself under, and then a research sports psychologist. And so the credentials and the training and the qualifications are different for each of these classifications. All right, so let's look at the clinical counseling sports psychologist, and those individuals are prepared to deal with the wide range of emotional and personality disorders that can affect some athletes, so abnormal behaviors as opposed to just normal things. And so in order to do that, you need to have a degree in clinical or counseling psychology. You need to be a full member of the American Psychological Association. You need to have a current license to practice psychology or psychiatry, and at least 3 years experience as an athlete, coach, or practitioner of sports psychology. And that's because, even if you do have those above credentials, if you don't understand the setting, if you don't understand, about the sports or sport, you can do more damage than you can do good. So they added that fourth thing here as recognition that you really need to understand the athletes and sports in order to do a quality job. So the educational sports psychologist then teaches correct principles of sports psychology to athletes and coaches, and it can work one-on-one with athletes and one-on-one with coaches as well. And the credentials are a little bit different, a doctorate in psychology, psychiatry, or physical education. So there's the difference, with a background that would meet APA membership criteria. You don't have to be a member, but if you chose to, you'd have what it took to be able to get membership. At least 3 years of experience as an athlete, coach, or practitioner of sports psychology, and then reference letters from people that are practicing in the field. And then finally, the research sports psychologist, sort of a behind-the-scenes scientist that contributes to the knowledge base through doing basic and applied research. Credentials, doctorate in psychology, psychiatry, or physical education. Again, background that would meet APA membership criteria. Evidence of scholarly research contributions to the field of psychology with application to athletes, and those recommendation letters. So anyone who is, practicing sports psychology needs to be concerned with, operating within ethical guidelines, and these are things that have emerged over the years as a result of a lot of different historical things. But these are the principles that guide the practice of sports psychology and certainly psychology in general. But Number one, responsibility, that you're responsible for your actions and the consequences of those actions on your clients. Second, the idea of competence, that you only provide services for which you have training and experience. So you operate within your scope of practice and training. You adhere to moral and legal standards. That means that you refuse to practice or participate in practices that are inconsistent with those. And then you make public statements that accurately and objectively state your professional qualifications and affiliations. Confidentiality is critical, so respecting the confidentiality of your clients and the information that you obtain from them in the course of your work. And then always keeping the welfare of your clients in mind, respect their integrity and in all things. Professional relationships, being sensitive to the needs and concerns of colleagues in related fields and establishing good relationships, referral relationships and things like that. And then utilizing assessment techniques that are proven to be valid and reliable tools for diagnosis and gathering data, whether you're doing research or whether you're using that information to diagnose and treat problems. And then finally, adhering to the guidelines for the research with human subjects. Most institutions have institutional review boards that are designed to protect the rights of human subjects. All of this goes back to some of the horrible things that happened in World War II with human experimentation by the Nazis on people in the concentration camps, and then even here in North America with things like the Tuskegee syphilis study. So always act in accordance with federal, state, and professional standards and protect the welfare of your participants at all times. And to remember, we're here to do good and to help people and not to harm people. All right, so again, as programs evolve, we talked about the individual certification, but what about the programs that prepare individuals to be sports psychologists? Well, at one time there wasn't a thing as accreditation, but when I went through a sports psychology program, it was fairly new, and we basically kind of almost made our own program with the help of our advisors and picking and choosing from courses across the curriculum in psychology and statistics and physical education, and we kind of cobbled together a program of study. But then, as the field evolves, then you get more specifics and more requirements and things, and you get an organization then that comes forward and says, all right, we're going to put the stamp of approval on these programs, and that's the Association for Applied Sports Psychology that controls the accreditation of sports psychology graduate programs. All right, so we also, as the field has evolved, we've also become more sensitive to multicultural issues, the concepts of inclusiveness and diversity. And diversity, of course, means respect for people from all different cultural backgrounds. Inclusiveness means that you don't exclude anybody or any group based on characteristics like race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or religion. And why is this important? Well, it's important because a large percentage of individuals in athletics are of different racial and ethnic backgrounds than most of the sports psychologists that work with them. So, racial ethnic minorities make up 29% of people in the United States, and that's growing. 68% of NCAA men's basketball players, 57% of football players, and 43% of NCAA women's basketball players. But yet, most psychologists are Caucasian. But yet many college and professional athletes are African American. And a lot of the leadership in sports, still athletic directors, coaches are white. So kind of leads to that concept of white privilege. And the next thing is a differentiation between race thinking versus racist thinking. I think we all know what racism and racists are. That's individuals that discriminate or harass people based upon their race. But race thinking just means that we need to consider it. We need to take into consideration race in the things that we do. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just acknowledging it and recognizing that it is a thing, but then doing what we need to do in terms of multiculturalism and cultural competence to try to understand people from different backgrounds. And then the difference between enculturation and acculturation. Enculturation is how we are raised and our values that are internalized because of the culture that we're raised in and the way that we're brought up. But acculturation means that we can then look at individuals through other lenses and appreciate the differences that might exist between them and ourselves. So sports psychology graduate programs should include a multicultural training component. And so those, it's designed to heighten awareness of and sensitivity to cultural groups that may be different than your own. Adds to knowledge, increases your knowledge about people from different cultures, and you learn helping and intervention skills through role-playing and simulated interaction. And then there's also a requirement in most programs where you have some sort of supervised practicum in a diverse setting. In addition to racial and multicultural issues, there's also issues related to gender. And so we've got a couple of terms here. Sexism, I'm sure we all know, is the exclusion or discrimination of individuals on the basis of gender. And then the movement of feminism kind of emerged probably in the late 60s and early 70s to help end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. And there's still obviously a need for that today. And then sexual orientation is another area that we need to be aware of and equipped to deal with. Different sexual orientation, gay, lesbian, transgendered, heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual. I think we know what homophobia is, a fear of individuals with gay, lesbian orientation. And then homophobic behavior obviously takes it to the next level and actually is people lashing out against those folks. Heterosexist behavior, and then trying to create a safe environment for people to come to us without fear of any kind of reprisal. So some of the things that we've come to learn, that homophobic behavior, and maybe you've seen some of this in your experience. It's common in physical education classes and elsewhere in high schools. Male athletes are presumed to be heterosexual, and so the focus usually is on their accomplishments as opposed to their sexuality, but that's different for females. The focus for female athletes is more on their sexual orientation than their accomplishments. Okay, so a few more issues here. Heterosexual athletes are perceived more favorably than athletes with an ambiguous sexual orientation. You have the issue of male coaches developing relationships with female athletes. I've seen that happen, even here at Georgia College a number of years ago, where one of the male coaches ended up actually having a relationship and marrying one of his female athletes. In this day and age with Title IX, you have to be very careful of that. Person in authority, and a person who's obviously they have some power over, that can lead to accusations of sexual harassment. Female coaches developing relationships with female athletes, another area of interest or concern. and then lesbian coaches and the kind of identity tension that could exist there. Okay, so I know that's a lot of material, but that's going to wrap it up here for Chapter 1, and we will be back at you here pretty soon with Chapter 2 on personality.